All right. Well, thank you, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I apologize if I sound a bit gravelly this morning. I have that kind of proverbial fall cold that won't quite go away. But spring is coming, and then I guess I'll feel better by then. My name is Shawn Smith. I'm a strata property lawyer located in White Rock, but we serve clients all over the Lower Mainland and a lot of them on the island. This is now my 24th year of practice of law, and all I do day in and day out is deal with strata issues. So I'm happy to walk you through this morning some considerations with respect to heat pumps and air conditioning. As Wendy said, it's not going to be technical issues. There's perhaps a reason I'm a lawyer. And so we'll deal with the law issues, and we'll let the experts and in the mechanical side of things deal with those on another time. So just a little bit about who I told you about who I am, who we are. Cleveland Doan is a full service law firm. We do all sorts of things, but one of our biggest practice areas is strata property law. And so we help strata corporations with everything that they encounter in carrying out their duties and running their complexes. So what will we talk about today? I'm going to touch on a few things: handling requests to install. So the obvious question, do owners need permission, and why do they need permission? When strata corporations can say no and when they can't. Some things to consider when approving requests. And I will highlight some broad technical things to be concerned about, but each strata should really look at those independently and get advice from the engineers and the trades with respect to specific things they need to be looking at, and then also addressing future issues that can arise. So what are we talking about? I happen to found a case, heat pumps, that talks about the definition of heat pumps and air conditioners from a legal perspective. This is the All West decision, and we will be referring to that a couple different times throughout the presentation because it dealt specifically with the installation of a heat pump. And there the court said that a heat pump can be part of an air conditioning system, but it's different from an air conditioning unit in that an air conditioning unit provides only cooling of the air. So this becomes important when you're drafting bylaws. What terms are you using? What are we actually capturing? Because there's common sort of definitions and terms throughout there when we talk about these things, but then there is an actual technical legal definition. So for the purposes of today's talk, I just thought I'd introduce by way of picture some of the different types of things we're talking about. So this is a picture of sort of the typical heat pump. And it's unique in that it heats and cools, draws in air from the outside, and then has an internal component that does the cooling and the heating. Very common these days, particularly in apartment style stratas, have been seeing mini split systems. So very similar to a heat pump, but they'll do maybe 1 or 2 rooms. And again, they have an inside and an outside component. And then there is the traditional air conditioner. So it could just be wall mount. Part of it sticks in, part of it sticks out, and just cools the air. Some terms that we may use as we're talking today: the condensing unit, that's the outdoor or outside component; evaporator, blower, that's the indoor component; and then of course there's conduit, the pipes that connect the two of those. I have come across there are some systems without external components. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner in the middle photo, there's just little vents sticking out. So that may be something else that your strata comes across and it has to consider how to deal with it. A lot of what we're going to say today will still apply to those situations. When owners are looking to install heat pumps and air conditioning, this is what they're looking for. They want to kick back on the couch, flip that remote, and let the cool, soothing air come in, which is a great goal. What Stratas are worried about, perhaps, is this. We don't aesthetics, and then the picture on the right, water damage caused by a leaking unit. So there may be very different goals and aspirations between the two parties when approaching this issue. We're going to start with the question of, is permission required? So if an owner wants to install a heat pump or a mini split or even a traditional air conditioning unit, do they need to get permission? Affects their strata lot, can't they just go ahead and do it? So I'm going to talk in terms of reference to the standard bylaws. Your strata corporation may have different bylaws with relation to alterations. Most bylaws use the standard bylaws, at least in some form, and then build on or adapt to those. So standard bylaw 5 applies to alterations to strata lots. And it requires an owner to obtain the written approval of a strata before making an alteration to a strata lot that involves a number of things. And I haven't repeated the whole list, but I pulled out the two that are likely to be most applicable in the context of heat pumps and air conditioning. And that's changes to the structure, so the framework of the building, as well as to the exterior. Bylaw 6 sub 1 comes into play as well, and it's approval for alterations to the common property. And so it's a little bit shorter and simply says you have to get approval before making alterations to the common property, including limited common property or common assets. And just common asset is something that the strata owns, so it would be a physical item, not necessarily land. When we're talking about these two bylaws, it's also important to understand the effect of Section 68 of the Strata Property Act, and that talks about the dividing line between strata lots and common property. And so the Act says, unless the strata plan says otherwise, the dividing line is the midway point of the exterior wall. So when you're punching through that hole for conduit or even a traditional air conditioner, you're going to be going through a portion of the common property as well as a portion of the strata lot. So typically both of these bylaws will be invoked. What the bylaws sort of leave as a question is, what constitutes an alteration? It just simply says alteration, doesn't give us any insight into that. That issue, again, was considered in the All West case. And All West dealt with an owner who had installed a heat pump, and the argument was whether or not he needed permission to do so. And one of the issues, both at the trial level and at the Court of Appeal, was actually what does constitute an alteration. And there's some cases from various jurisdictions that were referred to. At the end of the day, the Court of Appeal landed on a very, I guess, broad definition of an alteration, and essentially it started from the reverse perspective. It said immaterial changes to common property will not be alterations for the purposes of bylaw 6.1. So the flip side of that is anything that is material is going to be an alteration. And then it went on to hold that the cutting of a 2-inch hole in the exterior wall to feed the conduit through constituted an alteration. So that gives us an indication about how low that threshold is set for something that's considered to be a material change and therefore an alteration. I think what also influenced the court was, in the next paragraph, the fact that the heat pump, both, and I think it was a mini split in this case, was affixed both to the patio and the pipes were connected in through the wall. So the permanency had some play into the issue of whether the change was material or not. But that is basically the key case that you go to when you're looking at what constitutes an alteration. All West was similarly applied in the Simon Fraser University Foundation case, again dealing with the installation of a heat pump. So the court there again relied on All West and determined that the steps taken to install the unit were no different than what happened in All West, and therefore constituted an alteration. And again, the court in Simon Fraser looked at the fact that it was being affixed to the external portions of the building. So those two cases, I think, clearly support that if someone's installing a heat pump or a mini split, that those are going to be alterations that fall under the scope of bylaw 5.1 and 6.1 and are going to need permission. Strata corporations, though, may also have specific bylaws that address air conditioners and heat pumps. And I'm going to talk later on in the presentation about what you should ideally, in my opinion, have in your bylaws. But the Ottens case was just one I pulled out of the case law as an example. It had a very simple bylaw addressing air conditioners, and it said you mustn't install or attach them so that they're visible from the outside of the building. So also be familiar with your bylaws. Are there other little things like that that have been thrown in that are going to impact or address how you're going to give permission? And again, you may have a very detailed bylaw that sets out what information an owner is required to supply when they apply. It may establish conditions that the owner has to meet for approval, specify certain criteria regarding the installation, and it may even talk about locations and noise levels. So some stratas get right down to, okay, we're going to only allow them to be installed in certain locations in relation to each strata lot. So all of that, I think, helps owners know what they're facing when they're going down the path of seeking approval. They know in advance whether their unit's likely to be approved or not. I think a comprehensive bylaw also helps in terms of less ad hoc approach to approvals, and it also provides some continuity. Going forward, we all know how things are going to be dealt with and the conditions approved and conditions applied and what's going to be approved. So the more comprehensive bylaw is definitely my preference and recommendation to clients, as opposed to relying on just the standard bylaws. Now we'll talk about giving permission. So an owner asks, and do you have to give permission? And if so, what things can you consider? So as I indicated early, standard bylaw 6 is always going to apply because at least some part of the system is going to be on the common property. That could be the condenser, or will always be the condenser unit. And it may even be, if it's back to the traditional wall-mounted air conditioner with a little bit sticking out, you're still cutting a hole in the common property. There's a unique difference between standard bylaws 5 and 6. So standard bylaws 5 says the strata corporation must not unreasonably refuse approval. Standard bylaw 6 doesn't have that same condition. So when we're talking about changes to common property, there is no need the strata corporation can simply say no. They don't need to act reasonably in that. Now, of course, there are some limits to that. We're going to talk about those later on. But standard bylaw 6 would generally override anything in standard bylaw 5 in this context, because ultimately we're dealing with common property, even though there's a part of the strata lot that's being altered. In the Malloy decision, the CRT recognized that the strata has considerable discretion whether to approve the installation of a heat pump. And that was based on the wording of standard bylaw 6, again, recognizing that unreasonable refusal provision that exists in standard bylaw 5 doesn't carry over to standard bylaw 6. And just before we talk about how to apply those bylaws, I also want to talk about Section 71 of the Strata Property Act, because this comes up in numerous cases involving heat pumps. And so Section 71 says that the Strata Corporation must not make a significant change in the use or appearance of common property unless the change is approved by a resolution passed at an annual or special general meeting by a 3/4 vote. And I apologize. It's broken up a bit because they've added in new provisions now with EV charging. So Section 71's gotten slightly bigger than it used to be. So I pulled out the key parts just to look at in terms of that 3/4 vote requirement. So sometimes changes to the common property have to go to the ownership. They can't just be determined by council. So even though council may have gone through the alteration bylaws, looked at everything and said, that's great, we're going to give permission. Sometimes they simply can't. You have to go to the ownership. And so part of what comes up under Section 71 is what constitutes a significant change, because the Act, of course, doesn't define that. So there's a decision by the name of Foley, where the court looked at this and came up with 6 factors. I call them the Foley factors that you can apply when considering whether something constitutes a significant change in the use or appearance. And I describe it's more of an art than a science, because there's a lot of different, somewhat subjective factors you're looking at. Sometimes I describe it a bit as a soup. You put everything in, stir it around, and see what you come up with. But the first of those factors is visibility. So is the change visible to residents, the general public? Essentially, where is it and how many people are going to see it? So the more visible it is, the more it tends to go on the side of the balance of it being a significant change. And we'll see that in a couple cases we're going to look at in a moment. The second factor is whether it affects the use and enjoyment of the unit or other units. So does it make someone's unit better, or does it make someone's unit worse? And if the answer to either of those is yes, then it goes on to that side of the balance for significant change. The third and fourth factors, again, are very similar in interference or disruption as the result of the changed use. So again, does it negatively impact a unit or all the owners? What's going to be the effect of making this change? And does it impact the marketability or value of the unit? So there have been cases that said if this common property change actually makes the unit more valuable for the owner, then that tends toward it being a significant change in the use or appearance. That one is sometimes difficult to determine because it really technically requires some evidence from a realtor or an appraiser. But although sometimes it's obvious, if an owner built a 1,000 square foot solarium on the common property off of their unit, of course it's going to make their unit more valuable. The fifth factor is what sort of strata corporation are we talking about? Is it commercial, is it residential, or is it mixed use? So changes in residential stratas tend to be more significant than in a commercial. That's simply because it's people's residences, and there's a different sort of standard to be applied. And then the last factor is, what has the strata done in the past? So has it allowed or approved other similar changes, or has it denied them? One case said essentially it's a significant unfairness analysis under Section 164 of the Strata Property Act. So when you're faced with your first request for a heat pump or installation, you're going to have to look at these factors and determine whether or not you need to take the issue to the ownership for a 3/4 vote. So looking at just a couple cases on how Section 71 was applied, in Fleming, which is a 2021 CRT decision, the tribunal applied the Foley factors and in the end found that the installation of the heat pump was a significant change. And so some of the things that in that case the CRT relied on in reaching that conclusion was that these type of units create noise which can disturb people. Depending on where it is, what type of unit it is, it can cause a disturbance. And of course, in a residential strata, that is a greater issue. So that comes back to that fifth factor in Foley. Here they recognized that it improved the use of a strata lot. So it would make the strata lot more livable, cooler, nicer, so that the tribunal inferred would improve the value. Which again was another factor that they applied in reaching the significant change decision. And they also noted that the strata had not approved any other heat pumps before. This was the first one. Interestingly, in this case, visibility was not a factor because of where it was situated. It was couldn't be seen by other people. Leishman is another more recent case, again, where it was found that the installation was a significant change. And here the heat pump was much more visible to people, other units, people walking by. Once again, the CRT acknowledged that it improved the conditions in a strata lot, so that made it on the side of the ledger for significant change. And then it noted that if it's a small strata, only 23 units. So the installation of one heat pump was a bigger deal than, say, if it was 200 units. And then once again, that had never allowed them before. An interesting fact that they noted, which is not a Foley factor, but they said the high degree of permanence also made it a significant change. So basically, it was going to be there for the foreseeable future. So those two cases give you a bit of a flavor of how, or understanding of how Section 71 gets applied to heat pumps. However, not every installation is a significant change. So in this particular decision, the CRT reached the conclusion that the installation heat pump was not significant change because other strata lots had air conditioners. This wasn't the first one. In this particular case, it was not visible from anywhere else. And they said, well, it only had a minor positive impact on value. Having one room being cooled wasn't going to make the price increase, I guess was their logic. So you can see how this can be a very complicated fact-specific analysis. And ideally, you sort of only want to do the Section 71 exercise once. Not every installation necessarily needs to be looked at and approved under Section 71. So there's a couple ways that you can achieve approval under Section 71. If it's a bylaw that authorizes heat pumps and air conditioners and is very specific and broad about that, then I think that covers the Section 71 approval, because your bylaw needs to be approved by way of a 3/4 vote, so same voting threshold. And if it specifically says, yeah, we as owners are agreeing to authorize these and under these conditions in these places, I think you've met that. You could also just do a general resolution approving the installation of heat pumps across the board, subject to whatever alteration bylaws you have. So if you don't want to change your bylaws, you just want to approve going forward, you could do it that way. Or approval could be on a case-by-case basis. So each application that comes forward, the council could say, well, I don't think this is significant, we're going to approve it. Or yes, I think given the location or other factors, this particular installation is a significant change, we're going to take that to the ownership. And there's one other aspect of Section 71 that can arise that I didn't mention in the first definition. That's subsection A, permits a change without a vote if there's reasonable grounds to believe that immediate change is necessary to ensure safety or prevent significant loss or damage. Very similar to the emergency expenditure language found under Section 96 of the Act. So sometimes stratas, I should say, attempt to rely on this to get around the need to take a matter to the owners for a three-quarter vote. That issue was considered in the Peace and Hyde decision, where the owners wanted permission to install a heat pump because their furnace had died and they had no heat. And in the end, the CRT said, well, that was not an emergency under Section 71. It may be a discomfort and an inconvenience, but there was nothing in the evidence brought forward that an immediate, like right now change could not, what was needed. So that word immediate is essentially interpretive. If it can wait more than 20 days, being the time to call a meeting, then it's not immediate. So the flip side of peace, it wasn't an emergency because you didn't have heat. The flip side of that is it's not necessarily an emergency because you have a need for air conditioning or to cool the strata lot. Again, it may be preferable, but it may not be immediately necessary. So you may come up against that issue, and that should hopefully give you a little bit of framework as a strata council to deal with those urgent requests. So now that we've reviewed whether or not approval is required and determined that it is, you may or may not need to take the matter to the ownership for three-quarter vote. We're going to get into the particulars about actually reviewing the request and weighing it up, and can we say yes, can we say no? So one of the things that council should always be considering is the impact on the building. And again, I would encourage Stratas to get technical advice from engineers and other trade professionals about these issues. But these are things that should at least be on the Strata Council's radar when reviewing a request. So of course, you're penetrating the building envelope. What effect is that going to have, particularly as water ingress issue? Vibration. These are mechanical units. What do we need to do to prevent sound transferring elsewhere? Particularly, we're talking in an apartment style building, and possibly even a townhome if they're on balconies and roofs. Noise. How loud is the condenser when it's operating? How close is it going to be to someone's bedroom window, or even to their main living area? What impact is that going to have on others? And then condensate draining. So the outside unit condenses water. It has to go somewhere. Where is that going to go? Do we have to be specific about that given your particular design of your building? Some other things still to consider: impact, weight. Is there a weight issue given the unit that's proposed? One unit may be one thing. What if we're putting 6 on the roof in a particular location? What impact is that going to have? Perhaps less technical, but as equally important is appearance. Where is it going to be? What does it look like? And should it be screened with lattice or a hedge or some other material to obscure it? What about the conduit? How far is it running? Where is it running? Should it be hidden? Should it be painted? What should that look like? And then future repair and maintenance responsibilities. And I'm going to talk about that at the very end of the presentation, repair and maintenance and how we deal with it and address those issues. But these are the things that need to be on council's radar when they're looking at a request. You also need to consider the complex's electrical capacity. So how many units will be connected to the electrical grid? Where will the unit be connected to? You'd want it, I think, connected to the strata lots breaker so that the owner's paying the electrical costs, not connected to a common property outlet where the strata's bearing those costs. And then how does all that interact with EV charging? How many things can we have plugged in and operating all at once? So in the EV realm, electrical planning reports are going to be required in the near future. So that may help answer that question. If for some reason the regulations don't require the reports to be that broad, you may want to consider going beyond what the regulations require and having this issue investigated. So you can start to develop a plan to handle all of these needs all at once. And then again, you must also consider noise and the impact on others. So this particular decision, Suzuki and Monroe, it's a 2009 BC Supreme Court decision. It's not a strata decision, but it's two neighbors who were fighting over whether or not, and I believe it was the Monroe's heat pump, was constituted a nuisance at common law. So this is an interesting quote from the case. The court said, in my view, most people would consider an air conditioning unit operating in excess of 50 decibels only a few feet from one's bedroom window as being a serious and substantial interference with one's enjoyment of property. That last phrase is essentially the test for what constitutes a nuisance at common law. And you'll recall the standard bylaw 3(1)A requires or prohibits people from using their strata lot or the common property in a way that causes a nuisance. So this case would be applicable to any noise dispute. So that's why I say council should be considering noise when they're approving a request to install a heat pump, or if you're looking at it from a broad perspective, where we're deciding we want to approve to put these things, because you don't want to now be getting nuisance complaints, and as a council having to now deal with those and enforce bylaws against someone who's just spent several $1,000s to install a heat pump. So a little bit of preventative thought may prove valuable in the long run. So when you've gone through that analysis, you've looked at all of those things. Now you're at the proverbial fork in the road. You're going to say yes and you're going to say no. Or sorry, you're going to say yes or you're going to say no. If you're inclined to the council to say yes, we've looked at it all. We think we're prepared to approve it, regardless of whether you need to get approval under Section 71 from the ownership. Your approval needs to be clear and precise about a few things. What is being approved? So make and model, how many heads might the unit have? Some of them have multiple heads. Be very specific. Where is it going? So don't be afraid to sketch out a map or a plan. And then any specific requirements for installation, going back to the conduit, where are they going to be run? What do they need to look like? And then any other conditions that the owner must meet. So do they need to give a copy of the electrical permit, sign an assumption of liability agreement, anything else that council believes should be imposed, or maybe that the bylaws require to be imposed. And I say be clear and precise because I know this both from experience and reading the cases, a lot of disputes arise over an owner's given permission and they go and do something else. And if council goes to take issue with that, if the permission's vague, the owner may have gotten away with it, so to speak. So the more precise you can be, the better in that respect. Ideally, any of these conditions that you're approving should be found in the bylaws. There's an implied ability under the standard bylaws to impose certain terms and conditions, but my preference is to see them spelled out and grounded in the bylaw. Just a practice that I prefer. You should, when approving the installation, my recommendation is to have an approval letter that says, yes, you're approved to do this, and here's all the various conditions. The assumption of liability agreement should be a separate document. A lot of times those two get combined, and I think it gets a bit messy, particularly when we're trying to pass those obligations under that assumption of liability agreement down to future owners. So I'll just pause and just comment on the assumption of liability agreement is a document whereby an owner takes responsibility for repairs and maintenance relating to an alteration that the strata wouldn't otherwise have incurred. So sometimes they're called indemnity agreements, sometimes assumption of responsibility agreements, sometimes liability agreements. There's no technical name for them. Those are just sort of different names that get thrown about. But the same intent is an owner is going to contractually agree to be responsible for all the additional alteration expenses. You should also consider, does the strata need or want to inspect the unit once installed for compliance? And if so, at whose cost? So are you concerned about how it's been installed? Has it been installed properly? Have all the holes in the building envelope been sealed up? And if you want that inspected and you want it inspected by a third party, then that needs to be spelled out in the approval who's going to pay for that. The Matthews decision, which I noted just at the bottom of the slide, is a very recent decision. And it was one of those situations where Ms. Matthews was given approval to install a certain unit in a certain location, and she didn't. And then there was a dispute about whether or not she needed to remove it. And so what was clear from that case is a failure to comply with the approval terms meant the alterations unapproved. So that ties back to the previous slide and my comments about being specific. It makes it much easier to enforce when it's clear what they should have done. Sometimes the strata may have to say no, and not every request must be or even can be approved. What comes out of the case law, though, is where the strata does say no, it must have a clear and identifiable reason. So it can't sort of be arbitrary or off the cuff. So coming back to the Simon Fraser decision, the court there looked at the refusal and said there should be an explanation or evidence addressing how and why the council made its decision. So how, if you said no, how did you arrive at that? Was it a concern about electrical? Was it a concern about appearance? Was it a concern about noise? And all of those can be legitimate reasons to say no, but they need to be delineated somewhere in the minutes or in the letter to the owner as how you arrived at that decision. The Malloy case, which I mentioned earlier, held that it was reasonable and justifiable for the strata to refuse permission where it was concerned about a number of these topics or issues we've talked about. So the strata there was concerned about the noise to be created. Other people potentially requesting heat pump, likely appearance or electrical issues, concerned about piercing the building envelope, concerned about the effect on common property, and then the fact that there was a significant number of owners in the strata who actually said we don't want heat pumps and mini split systems throughout. So in that case, all of those were legitimate reasons to say no. Similarly, in Rasmussen, concerns about the cumulative effect of multiple units was held to be a valid consideration of the council in saying no. And then Kwan, as long as the reasons are good faith, then that should be fine. And so in this case, the tribunal said there's no suggestion that the strata had an ulterior motive. So, for example, just because an owner hasn't paid their strata fees or has a dog that's barking more than people would like it to bark, those are not reasons to say no. You have to have a good faith reason. But you also have to be careful because saying no could be significantly unfair under Section 164 of the Strata Property Act. So for those who are not familiar with Section 164, it's an oppression remedy, and it basically allows the court or the CRT to intervene where the strata has played by all the rules, met all the technical conditions and requirements under the Act. The decision is sound that way, but the decision is simply significantly unfair to the owner. And there's a fairly lengthy definition of that, but it's things like burdensome, wrong, harsh, lacking in probity and fair dealing, unjust, and inequitable. So basically, has the strata not played fairly? The key to note is that it's modified by significantly unfairly, not just unfairly. So a decision, even though premised on concerns, still might be significantly unfair. It's a very hard bar to meet. One case I found where the strata was held to have acted significantly unfairly was the West decision. And there the strata had said no to Mr. West's first proposal because they didn't like where it was and how it was being installed and how it affected the building. He came back with an alternative installation that addressed all of those concerns, and they still said no. And so the the CRT held that that was a significantly unfair decision because there was an installation method that addressed all of those concerns. Similarly, in Clark, the CRT addressed significant unfairness and said as long as there's the parties are exploring and the strata is exploring different alternatives, it's too early to say no, or too early to hold that there is a significantly unfair decision. So that's the SBA concern that you have to have when saying no. Are you acting in a significantly unfair manner? The other thing that impacts requests or can impact requests is medical requests under the Human Rights Code. And so under the Human Rights Code, a strata corporation, like other organizations, has an obligation to accommodate a person to the point of undue hardship. So that duty is grounded in Section 8 of the Human Rights Code, that you cannot discriminate against a person because of physical or mental disability. And so that's the ground that arises with respect to heat pumps and air conditioning, and quite often involves a person with a chronic medical condition. Just a couple before we look at disability and applying that, just a couple cases with respect again to the application of the Human Rights Code. The strata corporation is considered to provide services customarily available to the public, that being one of the conditions of Section 8. And then there's two very early decisions, Williams 2003 from the Human Rights Tribunal, and the Hardy decision, one of the early CRT decisions, that both confirmed that the strata provides management services. So that again is what co-ops it under Section 8 of the code, and now has this duty to accommodate. But is only accommodating a person with a disability. So what constitutes a disability was discussed in the Patterson dental case. Generally, it requires a state that is involuntary, has some degree of permanence, and impairs a person's ability to carry out normal functions of life. I should say in some measure, so it doesn't have to be a full incapacity or impairment. Normal ailments such as cold or flu are not disabilities. So again, comes back to that permanence. And then the medical conditions are characterized by a significant degree of permanence, which substantially interferes with the person's ability to participate fully in employment or enjoyment of life. So that's when the duty to accommodate kicks in. It's establishing that can be the difficult part. And that the onus of doing that falls to the owner making the request. So the Leary decision sets out a framework for dealing with requests for accommodation. So anytime that a strata receives a request from an owner to accommodate them under the Human Rights Code on the basis of disability, whether that's a request for a therapy pet, heat pump, or alterations to the building, they should be taking a look at the Leary decision and the framework set out in that. That framework makes very clear that the onus is on the owner to provide the medical evidence necessary to establish the nexus or connection between their disability and what they are requesting. The rest of the framework sets out obligations. It's a joint obligation of the parties to go back and forth and find a solution. The strata, if it doesn't like the requested accommodation, can't just merely say no. It would need to say no and then obliged to suggest an alternative. So when we're talking in the context of heat pumps, if an owner met the medical conditions that I want this heat heat pump in this location installed in this way. And Strata said, well, no, we don't really like that because of noise or the way it penetrates the building. The Strata can't just necessarily go back and say, well, you've come up with a new location. Leary says Strata needs to come back with an alternative proposal. One thing that arises when dealing with these medical requests would be if the bylaws prohibited air conditioners or heat pumps. So the human rights code sort of trumps all, and the bylaws don't really matter. If you have to accommodate someone, then you just overlook the bylaw. Otten's addressed how that works in terms of legal mechanics, because you can't give permission to do something that the bylaws prohibit. So in Otten's, the CRT held simply that the council is just choosing not to enforce the no heat pump, no air conditioner bylaw. The medical evidence in any accommodation request is really key. Does it connect all the dots? So first of all, establishing the person has a medical condition, establishing the need for cooling, and discussing other alternatives, and then how the need for cooling affects that condition. So in this first decision up on the slide, binge, the doctor's letter said that the owner only required air conditioning, not a heat pump. So the CRT said there's no need for the Strata to have approved the heat pump. That wasn't what was required for the accommodation. It was air conditioning, and air conditioning can be achieved through portable units and other methods. And then to trigger the accommodation, an owner has to prove an adverse impact flowing from the refusal to install them. So just because air conditioning might be nice, might be helpful, doesn't necessarily trigger the duty to accommodate. There has to be an adverse impact. So anytime that Strata is struggling with, or maybe not even struggling, received a request for accommodation on the Human Rights Code, it's probably not a bad idea to get just some initial legal advice to make sure that you're heading in the right direction, considering the right things. So if you have gone through all of that, approved the request, one other thing that Stratas need to consider, either in terms of the approval or in terms of bylaws, is future repair and maintenance. We're not just looking in all of this about the installation. We want to look down the road and say what problems might arise down the road that we have to address. And repair and maintenance is a really big one. So there's been several CRT decisions, Newman, Bowie, Monroe, that have held that a unit located on common property becomes part of the common property. So in other words, that external condenser unit, if it's just sitting on the common property next to the building, is common property. The fact that it services only one strata lot doesn't make a difference. It's still common property due to its location. There's another decision I didn't put in the slide, but by the name of Young, which is a CRT decision that very nicely discusses the law about fixtures and how something attached to the common property becomes the common property. So it's a well-recognized, accepted legal principle, but it creates a real problem in the realm of alterations and particularly heat pumps. And that is because Section 72 and Standard Bylaw 8D require the Strata Corporation to repair and maintain the common property and common assets. So in other words, that heat pump, even though it services my unit, if it's just sitting on common property, the Strata arguably has to repair and maintain it. And this may not arise so much with the owner who installed it, but if I sell, the new owner comes in and the heat pump now dies, they may be looking to the Strata under these principles to repair and maintain it. The very startling reality to the Strata and the rest of the ownership may be that they're obliged to do that. In Bowie, the CRT held that both the interior and exterior components, the whole system, was the responsibility of the Strata Corporation to repair and maintain, because it's an integrated single system. As is sometimes common with the CRT, there's a more recent case, Herrick, that held only the exterior components were the strata's responsibility. The interior components were the owner's responsibility. And in my opinion, I think that latter, the more recent case, is the proper interpretation of the case law and the application of the integrated whole approach. So I think it's only the exterior component that the strata would be on the hook for, should there be problems with it. Nonetheless, that is probably the most expensive part of the whole system, should it die. So there are ways to get around that. Fear not. So responsibility for those repairs can be transferred to owners in one of two ways. Coming back to that assumption of liability alteration agreement, or by placing the component on limited common property. And I'll talk about both of these in a bit more detail. So the assumption of responsibility indemnity agreements arise out of the bylaws. The standard bylaws talk about the owner agreeing in writing to be responsible for certain costs. Other bylaws can use different language or have more detail. In the heat pump air conditioning bylaw that our firm uses, we have a long section that talks about the agreement, what's in the agreement, and how it gets passed on to subsequent owners. The general way that that obligation gets passed down is through the Form B certificate. So there's the little question about, are there any agreements where the owner is taking responsibility relating to alterations? Yes, no. So if an owner installs a heat pump on common property, you as a strata are going to have them sign that assumption of liability agreement. That's going to be kept in the strata's records. When they sell, that's going to be noted on the Form B and then passed on to the subsequent owner. Some bylaws also have a provision that deems the new owner to be bound by the terms of that agreement, a little bit of just supplementing the Form B regime. What sort of things should be in a assumption of liability agreement? Obligation for the owner to carry out the repairs and maintenance. It should address cost to move it for strata work. So if the strata has to redo the building envelope, who's paying to take the heat pump in and out if it needs to be moved, and indemnity for damage. So what if the unit leaks, causes damage to things that the strata has to repair? You may even want to consider a release of claims by the owner. So what if the strata or one of its trades damages the heat pump? Is the strata going to be liable? And then what about future inspections? Does the strata want the right to inspect the unit and its operation, and then at whose expense? Whatever you decide you want to put in that agreement, those terms should be reflected, rooted, grounded in the bylaw that talks about that authorizes the agreement. The limited common property approach is another way to address the responsibility. So under that, it involves usually designating an area as limited common property by way of a 3/4 vote. So that requires a sketch plan to be prepared, to be approved by the owners and filed in the land title office. That sketch plan would generally show the pad on which the heat pumps sit. So there's a couple cases, Dowsley and Joyce, where that approach was approved. So the area in which the heat pump sits is designated as LCP, and then the bylaws get amended to transfer responsibility for the heat pumps from the Strata Corporation to the owner. It's important to amend the bylaws because the standard bylaws generally default responsibility for limited common property to the strata. So just designating as LCP and not changing the bylaws doesn't get you very far. The two have to go hand in hand. You cannot, unfortunately, just deem the heat pumps to be limited common property. There's a decision by the name of Triple P that says if it's limited common property, it has to be shown on a plan somewhere in the land titles office. So you can't just say all heat pumps are limited common property. Or alternatively, if you can, to make life simpler, you just place it on an existing LCP area, whether that be a patio or a balcony, and then amend the bylaws. That doesn't require a surveyor coming out preparing the plan. And those are the two ways to deal with repair and maintenance. The last issue I wanted to touch on was just about noise, because even though you've gone through the approval process, you've approved it, that doesn't mean you're out of the woods with respect to dealing with noise complaints. So standard bylaw 3.1 again says a strata must not, or an owner must not use a strata lot, the common property way that causes a nuisance, unreasonable noise, or unreasonable interference. So a heat pump or mini split system or air conditioner could create any of those things, meaning the strata corporation or the strata council needs to deal with them. So there have been CRT decisions that have recognized that heat pumps have the potential to create unreasonable noise. And then, of course, we go back to the Suzuki and Monroe case, where the court clearly said the operation of the heat pump at a particular level can amount to a nuisance. Peace and Hyde confirmed the duty to investigate whether the noise or nuisance is unreasonable. And that is not a duty that's unique to noise nor unique to heat pumps. Stratas have a duty to investigate bylaw complaints. This case was interesting because they looked at what was done and what was needed to determine that. And so the CRT said that there has to be some sort of testing to determine what the level of noise created is. Now, that didn't necessarily have to be a professional, i.e. an acoustical engineer. It could be somebody with their own equipment, cell phone or something, and make a measurement. What the tribunal also said is that whether the noise is reasonable or not is more than just a decibel rating. So it's not just, oh, took our reading, okay, we're good, move on. There are other things that could apply: frequency, changes in pitch and volume, time and day, other factors. So there's a lot that needs to be looked at beyond just what level of noise. And that was emphasized in this Kinsey decision, where the CRT said you can't just make a blanket finding that noise will never be unreasonable. So you can't say, well, heat pumps, they're never going to create unreasonable noise. There has to be contextual evaluation of the circumstances of the complaint. In other words, council can't just brush it off. And even if the heat pump was installed prior to any bylaws being passed, it's still going to be subject to the noise bylaws. And so council may have to deal with those complaints. So ideally, to help you assist with that, bylaws allowing heat pumps should address how to deal with noise. So for example, they could contain a provision that the owner has to carry out any directions given to the council or given by the council with respect to alterations and changes that are needed. So it's again some tools to help council deal with those future complaints. So going forward, where do you go from today? My recommendation is that Stratas develop a comprehensive approach to heat pumps and air conditioners. So where are we going to put them? What things are we concerned about? And that kind of ties into the second point: assess your electrical system capacity. How many can you say yes to? For newer buildings, this may not be an issue. For older buildings, it may. And then again, keep that in mind with or tandem with your EV charging. How are we going to address this overall electrical issue? Once you have your plan, get good bylaws, good assumption of liability agreements in place, have all those things properly addressed in from a legal perspective, and then monitor how it's going. So things change. The law can change, technology can change, owners' wishes can change, the assumptions that we made going into a particular situation can change. So how is it going? Do we need to tweak, improve, or address things any differently?
Okay, well, thank you so much, Shawn, for the webinar today, and we will sign off now.
You're most welcome. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a great Saturday. Bye.